So welcome everybody to our first hybrid session. Welcome everybody in the room. Welcome everybody online. So just before we kick off, I'd like to flag the next seminar, which is on the 11th of January. That will be an online seminar. Our speaker to be confirmed. But today we have Aparajita Mukhopadhyay, who is part of the history team at the University of Kent, and she will be speaking on railways and reimagining travel in colonial South Asia. So, Aparajita, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Liz, for handling the technical bits. So what I want to do this evening is to present here a paper which is sort of, in the process of getting published. So I would really welcome any suggestions and guidance or comments from the audience this evening. So this paper essentially rethinks the ways in which technology transfer in a colonial context was mediated by people who were using this technology, in this case, a railway technology. And I will be thinking about how using railways for traveling and different kinds of traveling sort of enabled Indian passengers, again, of different social background, to add new meanings to travel, which had longer sort of, implications than it is, apparently visible. So essentially, I will think about in this paper as how railway travel sort of enabled the colonized population to reconceptualize travel and sort of, with broader implications for themselves, for imagining identity and nationhood. So in a poem, which was quite popular and written by a very popular Bengali poet in the early decades of the 20th century, the poem described by that time what had become a popular practice, that is traveling by trains during vacations, Christmas break, summer holidays, things like that. It is perhaps not a coincidence that the poet associated this shift in travel habits with trains, the technology that had allowed Indians to travel far and beyond with certain degree of regularity. Indeed, contemporary sources, which include newspaper reports, pamphlets, travelogues written by Indian railway travelers, indicate remarkable involvement with the new technology of transit. And what is interesting in these documents, which is something I will bring out in this paper, is essentially how railway travel sort of helped Indians to reconceptualize different meanings of travel, adding sort of, new ways of thinking about travel, but also finding sort of, older meanings of travel and changing their sort of, associations. So using this poem, therefore, as a literary entry point, this paper will argue for reappraising nature of technology transfer in a colonial context by illustrating how colonial South Asians mediated and shaped the impact of railways on travel in late colonial India. Now, just to put a bit of background in this context, the introduction of railways in mid-19th century India, as is possibly widely known, was primarily to establish more efficient economic and military control over the region. Consequently, when the first trains rolled out of Bombay, which is now Mumbai, in April 1853, neither the railway promoters nor members of the colonial administration thought railway travel will be popular amongst Indians, because trains, and I quote here, were opposed to the present habits of the people, quote closed. Such perceptions, however, was proven wrong, as Indians took to railway travel both instantaneously and enthusiastically. Half a century later, that is at the turn of the 20th century, reminiscing on Indian passengers' initial enthusiasm for railway travel after the introduction of trains in eastern India, George Huddleston, who was then the chief superintendent of Eastern Indian Railway Company, wrote, and I quote, this is a fairly lengthy quote, so please bear with me. The first division of experimental line was opened for passenger traffic on 15th August 1854, and a fortnight later an extension was added. During the first 16 weeks, no less than 109,000 passengers were carried, and gross earnings were £6,000 on an average of £424 per week. And the board of the Eastern Indian Railway Company reported, looking to the small portion of line opened, the traffic has far exceeded the most sanguine expectation. And perhaps the most gratifying feature of all is in the fact that, contrary to popular belief, in the indisposition and inability of the natives to avail themselves of railway communication, by far the largest number of passengers carried has been of the third class. The following is an analysis of the traffic: first class, 5,000 passengers; second class, 21,000 passengers; third class, 83,000 passengers. So as you can see, there's a remarkable sort of, way in which railway revenue was driven by the passenger traffic. And of course, Indians traveled largely, though not exclusively, in third class carriages. Clearly, therefore, since its introduction, railways magnified number of passengers. And while travel was not unknown in pre-railways India, the prospect of relatively speedier travel, and I call it relative because the first railways were running at a speed of 20 to 25 miles per hour, again, not something vastly different from what was happening in England at that point of time, and an expanding railway network significantly added to the number of people who decided to travel. Of this, the most noticeable increase was of those who took the trains to important Hindu pilgrimage sites, though sort of lesser known pilgrimage sites also began to attract a sizable number of pilgrims because of this railway connection. This increase was as much a result of conscious planning of railway routes towards the pilgrimage centers as it was due to trains making pilgrimage an all-seasons affair by breaking down its erstwhile seasonality previously associated. Given this visibility of railway passengers who were also pilgrims, it's perhaps not surprising that prevailing analysis of impact of railways on travel in colonial India have mainly focused on pilgrimage. But moving away from this historiography, this paper and the sources which I have examined for this paper will indicate, and that includes hitherto unexamined travelogues and pamphlets and newspaper articles, will show that the impact of railways on travel in late colonial South Asia was way more complex and nuanced than presently assumed. The paper will demonstrate how Indians shaped the impact of railways on travel by conceptualizing it as useful, and that this perceptual shift was accompanied by an invention of new categories of travel, while existing traditions, for instance, pilgrimage, were significantly modified. These changes, this paper will show, had wider consequences, especially around issues of sectarian identity formation and nationalism. Recent analysis of technology transfer in colonial South Asia have already questioned older understanding of introduction of Western technologies as, inherently as means for tools of empire. However, impact of railways continues to be largely assessed by emphasizing how Indians used trains for subversive ends. Deviating from this historiographical intervention, the paper here will argue how various needs and aspirations of different social groups in late colonial India mediated the introduction of railways and its impact on travel. In short, this paper will reprise technology transfer in a colonial milieu, underlining the diverse and varying nature of the agency of the colonized. Writing in 1860, the year in which a direct railway connection from Calcutta to northern India was established, an author of a Bengali travelogue noted crowded scenes at the terminating station of the East Indian Railway Company, and especially at the third-class ticking booking counter for tickets. Indicating a degree of continuity, another Bengali travelogue published in 1911 described a similar scene for passengers clamoring for tickets at a station in North India. Despite the time gap between these two accounts, both authors, interestingly, interpreted this demand for tickets as indicative of a wider shift in people's perception of travel as an activity worth pursuing. More crucially, the authors linked this perceptual transformation to introduction of railways claiming that since trains had made journeys shorter and faster, older notions of travel as time-consuming or dangerous have been replaced by a newfound appreciation. This causal connection between practical advantages proffered by a new mode of transit and a consequent shift in perception towards travel was not unique. Since the commencement of railway operations in mid-19th century India, pamphlets, travelogues, as well as railway records maintained by the railway company, as well as the different kind of colonial provincial government records, underline the ways in which trains transformed people's perceptions of why they traveled. For instance, a Bengali pamphlet published as early as 1855, that's the same year first railways ran in the region, claimed, unlike pre-railway days, travel was now regarded as safe, underlining the impact of trains in making daily commute from suburbs around Calcutta a popular practice. Another Bengali pamphlet published in 1863 argued trains had made traveling safe to the point that it allowed pregnant women to travel to their natal homes for childbirth. A similar pamphlet penned by a prominent Bengali intellectual argued, compared with other forms of land or water transit, trains were the safest. This pamphlet was perhaps an effort to allay early anxieties about railway travel amongst local passengers. However, as both passenger statistics and travelogues suggest, despite concerns, trains induced a clear shift in perceptions about travel. This shift is perhaps most noticeable in the ways in which authors of the travelogues disassociated notion about travel from previously established Indian conventions of either eloquent silence or explicit condemnation. Instead, travel was argued to be useful. And though none of the authors defined what useful constituted, a rather sort of handy vagueness, as we will see later in this paper, the continued use of the word suggests an idea rather akin to education, offering possibilities of self-improvement. The author of a travelogue underscored the connection by pithily noting how traveling produced knowledge. Similar thoughts were echoed by a school student whose travel narrative began by noting, and I quote, knowledge and pleasure accrued from traveling to new places. Author of a Bengali travelogue expounded on the benefits of travel in a rather elaborate manner by noting, and I quote, knowledge is enhanced and refined by traveling. Acquiring new knowledge and education through travel diminishes arrogance and narrowness of mind. No other instructions or lessons can inscribe knowledge in our hearts more than traveling, quote closed. The authors of most of these travelogues conveyed similar thoughts, though with varying degrees of earnestness. One of them argued traveling was a remedy to satiate desire for learning, seeing, and experiencing new things. Another claimed, and I quote, without traveling, it was difficult to achieve either self-realization or progress, quote closed. Some authors even chose specific audience to disseminate their experiences of benefits of travel. For instance, a woman author of a Bengali Hindi travelogue published the account of her travel from Lahore to London for women of Punjab who were restricted behind parda, or the the domestic, the domain of private, and could not therefore enjoy either traveling or experience its associated benefits. Similar sentiments were also influenced the author of a Bengali travelogue, once again a woman, to publish a travel narrative. Given such belief in travel as education, it is perhaps not surprising many of these authors found the Grand Tour as a template worth emulating. The Grand Tour was praised for taking generations of European youth away from the confines and comforts of home, while acquainting them with the outside world through a demanding travel schedule and imparting valuable lessons, both academic and otherwise. Clearly, therefore, largely as a result of ease of transit, travel in late colonial South Asia came to be thought as both safe and useful. This was a simultaneous move away from traditional Indian perceptions of travel and a conscious borrowing from Europe, where notions about benefits of traveling on both mind and body had enjoyed an enduring presence. But a closer reading of these travel as education prescriptions in the Bengali travelogues revealed the process was not a simple and wholesale discarding of indigenous ideas, nor it was an enthusiastic acceptance of the so-called colonial discourse. If anything, this reconceiving of travel as a practice that offered specific advantages illustrates significant deviations from European notions, a discussion to which I now turn. I start with a quote from a Bengali travelogue. These days, everyone travels for change of air. Foolish me, I have little understanding why travel for change. After all, the object of its concern, that is the human body, is perishable and will turn into ashes after cremation, that is. Quote closed. The disapproving tone of the above excerpt suggests that travel was reconceptualized as useful. However, it also led to a hierarchization in which some kinds of travel came to be more valued than others. Of all kinds of travel, newspapers and travelogues recommended Desh Bhraman, a Bengali word which can be roughly translated as traveling across the country, a new, though not altogether distinct category of travel as the most useful one. This category of travel was argued to be useful for two reasons. One, visits to historical places was likely to trigger thoughts about the contrast between India's glorious past and its gloomy present under a foreign rule. And B, knowing the land and its inhabitants offered a better understanding of India, especially its vastness and the diversity. An author of a Bengali travelogue conveyed why Desh Bhraman was the most useful form of travel by simply noting, and I quote, India is an enormous book, a perusal of which should start with an acquaintance with the language of travel, quote closed. Expressing similar sentiments, another author claimed Desh Bhraman's especially visits to ruins of forts and palaces demonstrated India's glorious past was a historical reality, not a myth. Surendranath Ray, a noted journalist, claimed in his travelogue, and I quote, Desh Bhraman not only satiates curiosity, it also leads to acquiring of unlimited knowledge and experience of visiting new places and meeting new people. The author of a Hindi travelogue also thought that such kind of travel was a key source of acquiring experience and knowledge. Elaborating upon the idea, he argued, and I quote, as a result of this, i.e. traveling across the country, humans conveniently acquire a knowledge of the differences between different groups of people, their cultures, thoughts, differences in geographical locations, and so on. Though widely peddled, especially in Bengali travelogues and newspapers, Desh Bhraman, or traveling across the country, however, was not the only useful form of travel recommended by the authors of the travelogues. Pilgrimage came a close second, a hardly surprising choice given that pilgrimage has long been associated with a form of self-improvement. But this recommendation of a pilgrimage as useful came with a caveat. Not all pilgrimage was regarded as useful. Instead, in an ahistorical and scripturally dubious reconfiguration, pilgrimage involving leisure and pleasure was criticized as harmful. For instance, noting Bengalis crowding second-class reserved carriages to travel to Hindu pilgrimage sites, one bystander and the author of a travelogue wondered, and I quote, if pilgrimages were created for these light-hearted, pleasure-seeking pilgrims. Traveling across pilgrim centers, another author voiced similar sentiments, saying pilgrimages have now become like fetes organized by Lady Mentor, the then viceroy. This criticism of arguably degeneration of pilgrimage, however, was accompanied with an interesting formulation. The authors of the travelogues and pamphlets claimed pilgrimage in essence was an older version of Desh Bhraman, that is traveling across the country, entailing travel from one pilgrim center to another scattered across India. One author, for instance, argued, and here I quote, amongst university graduates in the West, there is a well-established practice of traveling for acquiring knowledge and experience. It is true that we Indians also had a similar tradition of Desh Bhraman that has now fallen into disuse for a number of reasons. Acquiring knowledge while on pilgrimage is a superior practice as it also involves spiritual growth. Now, with trains, we can once again venture out on pilgrimage and acquire knowledge for self-improvement and for greater social good. Another author elaborated in the following words, and I quote, "In the West, young graduates are sent away for self-improvement and progress. This custom was also prevalent in ancient India, but it fell in disuse. The arrival of Hindu-hating Muslims led to the degeneration of this useful practice. Though traveling is useful, but by undertaking pilgrimage, one also acquires spiritual progress. This advantage was not lost on ancient Hindus, illustrating the utility of the practice." Similar thoughts were repeatedly echoed by several authors. Indeed, therefore, in this new formulation, pilgrimage came to be redefined as an older, more spiritually satisfying form of Deshbraman that had been present in India since the days of Hindu mythological epics. In a diatribe that conflated Deshbraman with Tirthabhraman, that is pilgrimage, as well as rejecting the idea of travel as education as entirely Western in origin, one author claimed, "Of course, in past people were unfamiliar with how to write about Deshbraman after crisscrossing the country in 15 days by train. As now, then, people did not go for Deshbraman to improve themselves. In those days, people were usually God-fearing and had regard for religion. They also knew that activities entailing religion would improve their body as well as soul. Hence, they went for Deshbraman, propelled by religious spirit, endured hardship to travel to distant pilgrimages, and returned having gained both physical and moral upliftment." Crucially, authors claimed people had forgotten how travel was considered useful, largely because of the Muslim interregnum. Muslim rulers, the authors argued, systematically, and I quote, "systematically erased useful tradition of travel, aka pilgrimage, thereby contributing to its degeneration." In 1855, one such author wrote, "The condition of roads and means of traveling described in Hindu mythologies is a sufficient reflection of the state of affairs in the Hindu period. During the Muslim rule, however, the roads were miserable, infested with bands of robbers. Now, with the introduction of trains, pilgrimage will be cheaper and faster, and everyone will be able to travel." Another author made the link even more explicit by claiming, and I quote, "In ancient time, Aryans always traveled for pilgrimage. But slowly time changes. Eventually, Hindu-hating infidel Muslims asserted their supremacy over India. Hindu pilgrimage centers were destroyed and roads to pilgrimages became difficult to traverse due to lack of repair and presence of brigands. For all these reasons, common folks were not interested in traveling anymore, and pilgrimage as a custom fell into disuse, except for those who wanted to abandon their domestic duties." Quote closed. Despite appearances, here I argue that these pronouncements of belief in travel as education and blaming Muslim rule in India for disrupting a well-established practice of useful travel was not an indiscriminate acceptance of colonial discourse. Evidently, the authors of the travelogues and pamphlets were selectively appropriating European notions of travel as education, including the Grand Tour. But new meanings were also added to suit Indian, here upper caste Hindu needs. It is perhaps not without significance that deviating significantly from the European notion of travel as education for self-improvement, travel in the pages of these travelogues was mainly recommended for collective social regeneration with explicit political goals. At a related level, unlike Europe, nowhere in the pages of these travelogues an attempt was made to define useful. This lack of definition, as I hinted earlier, added a vital component of flexibility, allowing authors to suggest pilgrimage or Deshbraman or change of air could be equally useful, the latter being contingent upon context. Equally importantly, though Grand Tour was touted as a model of useful travel, nowhere, however, does the author suggest that travel should involve pleasure. While sowing wild oats was not even mentioned, a rather significant departure from what constitute as typical behavior from the participants of the Grand Tour. Indeed, as criticism of degenerate pilgrims indicate, pleasure was particularly rejected as a part of travel as education, presumably because in the case of colonial India, travel was recommended for realizing very different goals than Europe. that conscious departures from European notions and practices were based on an awareness of difference of India's socio-political context is also evident from reformulation of pilgrimage as an older form of Desh Bhraman, or thus useful. This reframing had little, if any, basis in either early modern or modern European ideas of travel and its attendant benefits. If anything, reconceptualizing pilgrimage as Desh Bhraman was an attempt to add new meanings and practices to both the categories of travel, a process with wider consequences. Reconceptualizing travel as useful added a new category of travel, as I have already said, Desh Bhraman, traveling across the country, and modified older traditions, such as pilgrimage, largely by ascribing an ahistorical fixity to it, while adding new meanings. Here I will show that these changes had wider implications, some more visible, others less so, though equally significant. The most tangible and wider impact of this process was perhaps the creation of a new category of travel, Desh Bhraman. Clearly, both the word Desh Bhraman and the notion of it, that is traveling across the country, its advertised benefits were all products of colonial encounter, inasmuch the ways in which benefits of Desh Bhraman was celebrated in the travelogues leave us with little doubt as to why it was thought to be the most useful form of travel. It was a prescription for infusing a sense of pride accrued from past glories amongst a colonized population, arguably to foster a sense of nation and nationalism. But the list of sites that the authors of these travelogues recommended as a must visit to feel proud in India's past glory reveals an interesting pattern. The places chosen were a combination of pilgrimage centers and ruins of forts and palaces scattered across northern and western India. Prominent in this list were places associated with glorious history of pre-Islamic India. A discussion of what constitutes Desh or nation in this prescription is beyond the scope of this paper. However, the choice of destination and the accompanying descriptive notes in the travelogues indicate that nation was conceptualized as a Hindu nation, with its contours being defined by sites with a history of anti-Muslim resistance. Furthermore, references to India's glorious past were almost always about pre-Muslim period and accomplishments of pre-Muslim rulers and dynasties, a choice suggestive of ignoring Islamic past as well as a silence on the shared historical heritage. Also, while touring across the country was peddled as a means to familiarize with diverse populace of India, the authors of travelogues made no reference to Muslims except as largely denigrated historical figures. This absence of any reference to meeting Muslims, even as co-passengers on their railway travels, can be construed as a particularly significant omission if one also bears in mind that given the itinerary, the authors traversed through regions with high density of Muslim population, that is North India. In short, this prescription to recover pride in a past untainted by foreign presence, with both Muslim and British conflated as equally alien, aggressive, and detrimental to India's well-being, is well worth rethinking sort of how Indians participated in this process of reconceptualizing travel for their own ends. Given this specific understanding of India's past, and conceptualizing nation in religious terms, it is perhaps no coincidence that pilgrimage was argued to be a form of Desh Bhraman with added traction of ancient tradition and past usage. Indeed, it can be suggested that this formulation of pilgrimage as an older form of Desh Bhraman implied that the geographical contours of nation has always been a product of Hindu religion, and Indians, that is Hindus, have since time immemorial conceptualized nation as an interlinked space of pilgrimage sites. That this idea of imagining nation as a sacred geography enjoyed currency is evident from the ways in which some authors describe their travels interchangeably as tirthayatra or pilgrimage, without any qualms about fusing the two. A noted Bengali playwright wrote in his travelogue, and I quote, "We left Banaras, a prominent Hindu pilgrimage site, and took the train for pilgrimage to another site. Everyone in the family are happy to be joining me in Desh Bhraman." So here, therefore, the purpose and the process both gets conflated with both the meanings. Similarly, another author claimed his decision to part ways with two Bengali travelers was because his intention was Desh Pramon, while the latters were pilgrims. Nonetheless, he visited prominent Hindu pilgrimage sites such as Benares, Mathura, and other sites. Such instances were, however, not singular. All authors who professed Desh Pramon or traveling across the country as their purpose of travel also visited pilgrimage sites. At a related level, some authors chose pilgrimage or some version of the word as a title for their travelogues. But this also did not desist them from describing their travels as Desh Pramon. Here, therefore, is a significant overlap between different purposes of travel, and despite a clear understanding of differences, at least of the definitions, it can be suggested that for most authors, a clear distinction in forms and aims of travel does not exist because pilgrimage could double as Desh Pramon. It is perhaps self-evident that notwithstanding niceties of definitions, travels aimed at regaining glorious Hindu past sharpened sectarian identities in late colonial India, thus adding to growing feelings of nationalism based on narrow religious identities. Equally importantly, though not explicitly, this railway-induced formulation of traveling across the nation as pilgrimage or vice versa shows technology transfer was mediated by Indian agency. After all, besides anti-Muslim tirade in these travelogues, frequent references to India's Aryan past also undermined claims of British civilizational superiority, and by implication, justification of colonial control over India. Mediation in technology transfer is also evident in the ways in which pilgrimage came to be reformulated as an older form of Desh Pramon. On one hand, this was a riposte to the colonial state's claims of lack of traditions of travel amongst Indians, a drawback that was often cited as an evidence of Indians' purported desire for progress. At another, reconceiving pilgrimage as a more utility-oriented travel permitted appropriation of a new mode of transit as a suitable vehicle for journeys of self-exploration of either spiritual or political variety. This attempt to inject new moral and material meanings to pilgrimage can be interpreted as a product of reformed Hinduism, itself an offspring of the colonial administration's long-standing criticism of Hindu rituals and practices. But, as religious scholars have shown, pilgrimage for Hindus has always been more of a folk tradition than textual. Consequently, both enjoyment and salvific attainment often did not have anything to do with the intention of the pilgrim. Pilgrimage could therefore be conveniently repackaged as Desh Pramon, or for that matter, any other form of travel, and yet did not lose its ability to offer religious merit. As the sort of evidence brought here shows from the travelogues, this flexibility of pilgrimage was not lost on the authors of the travelogues. Surely, condemnation of pleasure and discussions about degeneration of pilgrimage suggests an attempt to ascribe a scriptural prescriptive to an inherently flexible tradition. Nevertheless, the reality of authors combining or conflating Desh Pramon with pilgrimage suggests an awareness of how the latter remained a folk custom open to changes. So to conclude, therefore, hopefully this paper has shown how a cross-section of Indians, mostly elite, mediated the impact of introduction of railways on travel in late colonial South Asia by one reconceptualizing travel as useful and inventing new categories of travel while modifying extant traditions. However, as this evidence is mostly gleaned from textual sources, literary sources, it will be expedient to reflect upon the possibility of a wider diffusion of these ideas. The number of people who could have read the travelogues and newspapers were not substantial, thinking about the literacy rate here. But crucial here would be to remember that in late colonial India, established traditions of orality interacted with a vigorous print culture. Equally importantly, the passenger statistics substantiates people traveled in trains, regardless of whether they read the travelogues. In other words, the notion that trains have made traveling easier was also experienced practically by an increasingly significant number of people. If one adds to this that largely due to the nature of pilgrimage, for most people, including the authors of the travelogues, Traveling entailed visiting different pilgrim centers while taking in the sights. Imagining the nation in religious terms wouldn't have been difficult, as pilgrimages were sites in which identities were refined and information absorbed. Also, these travels and travelogues were a product of a wider late 19th and early 20th century India, a period when politics of identity formation reached its defining moment. As such, the ideas contained in the pages of the travelogues were also available beyond the covers, both literary and metaphorically. And in all likelihood, many railway travelers accessed similar ideas from different sources, such as factory sites, membership of different caste or religious groups, or affiliation to political parties and municipal and civic politics. Lastly, we must consider impact of mass transit, especially railway travel, on notions of identity by standardizing what ought to be seen and how travel experiences were interpreted. Though presently such analysis mostly focus on Europe and the USA, as is evident here, in late colonial South Asia too, railway travel shaped formation of identities, including imagining India as a Hindu nation and rejecting claims of Western civilizational superiority. These are as much evidence of technology transfer being mediated through the colonized as they are illustrative of appropriation of a new technology for purposes beyond subversion of colonial rule. The paper, therefore, argues for a reappraisal of nature of technology transfer in a colonial milieu by underlining the variegated and varying role of the colonized in mediating and shaping the outcome of the process. Thank you.